I think it's kind of even beyond the migrant worker. I think the plight of the migrant worker was so graphically and tragically in the way they uprooted their lives and were walking barefoot for thousands of kilometers. No other countries which are at the bottom of the income, the per capita income ranking, saw this. I mean, we go on about feeling superior to sub-Saharan Africa, etc. Which other country in the world had its own people, critical components in the building blocks of how we live? How we get our water that we drink, how the roads the makers, the builders of modern India, or the builders of India actually, were driven to this desperation. But I think it's kind of beyond migrant workers. What it unveiled very, very tragically, but very graphically, was what was in part unveiled in 2008. So I'll just go back a little bit, Dushyant, if I may.
Oh, sure, please.
So the 90s, when the Soviet Union collapses or you have the wall falling, there is all this euphoria to capitalism in the Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher way that, we're all responsible for our own destiny and you don't work hard enough, which is why you're not well off or you're not getting your wages. There was this deep kind of individual way of looking at the world and seeing how the economy was fashioned. Capitalism was declared victorious, history had ended. So that whole phase kind of came mercifully to a grinding halt in 2008 when the crash or the financial markets crashing kind of crashed the party really. So I think there was an understanding, and poverty and inequality became not fringe issues. Before that, that was being tucked away. I think what the pandemic does is complete the cycle, especially for anybody who's listening and watching in countries like India. It underscored the importance of looking at poverty and inequality. And the point you very masterfully kind of caught on in what I had said was that how the new path forward as we move on from the pandemic, whenever we do, God knows when we will, is that it will have to be centered around people. I'll give you a small example. The whole notion of the word development, for instance, or of talking about progress centers around visible markers of, say, infrastructure. In how governments advertise this, that, you'll get shiny roads, you'll get bridges, you'll get high-rise malls. Those kind of visible, shiny markers are meant to be what development is. I think we'll have to go back to what economists have been hammering home for years, and which the shared experience, the lived experience, and what thousands of people like Seema Pathak are telling us today, is that it has to be on capabilities and the how much you invest in people, in your own, your 1.3 billion people, how healthy, how well educated, how capable, how confident they are. And so they're enabled to live their lives better. So from an emphasis on this physical infrastructure, I'm not for a minute saying that roads aren't important or that everything that centers around built stuff is not important, but the whole focus will have to move towards enabling lives to go on. And it's not as if we don't have examples of the success of this approach. In the 50s, and this is actually taught in the Harvard kind of papers, it's taught in the global health manuals about how it was decided by the government, the state government in 1956, that health will have to be prioritized in Kerala. They came under tremendous criticism that public health is so expensive. How can Kerala, a poor state at that time, it has no economy to speak of. This is the 50s, mid 50s in India. How will you do health for all? How is public health even possible? They inverted the whole thinking of economics, and they say, no, if you have able, healthy people, they will make for better workers, better consumers, better voters, better people who can make choices better. And you now have Kerala, which is competing with per capita, with Goa, with Delhi, with the highest states, and it has a fine. So there is no divorce between a healthy, well provided for educated people and a good economy. So I think, to answer your question in brief, we'll have to just shift the emphasis onto healthier and better supported lives rather than prosperity markers of glitz and glam.
And do you think that the experience of the last 4-5 months, or whatever, has led to an awareness either in the non-governmental sector or in the government or among other experts, that perhaps there is something fundamentally wrong, or perhaps we need to take a fundamentally different path, or take the Kerala route, or do you think that awareness has sufficiently registered?
So I think not. So there's a very clear divide. There are two parts to this, that, what needs to be done and what will be done. So I think it has not been taken into account. It's astounding that the Prime Minister of the country or the Health Minister are yet to hold a single news briefing where they take questions or they address the problem of COVID. India is contributing to the largest number of cases of COVID in the world, which is not to say that we need to get spooked by this ranking thing, but somebody has to get up and bell the cat. But they naturally, being so good at managing optics, realize that the minute they say it, they'll be saddled with the job of being responsible for it. So they just stay above the fray and not talk about it at all. So I think everybody's conscious of what's going on, and we have, by way of an intuitive understanding that people have. But in terms of our systems, people in power, I don't think that, if anything, everything will be done to distract from their responsibility. The Indian economy, the post-90s phase particularly, and as I mentioned that in my essay, which you all very kindly allowed me to write, is that it's premised on the dihadi economy. It's premised on people who, it's a terrible sort of a slumdog millionaire type scenario with people who have actually nothing that you provide them with. But for that particular daily wage, they are there to dig your wells. They're there to build your stadiums or whatever you choose to get them to do. And that has built the prosperity that we speak of. But I don't think there's an awareness that that will happen. And in fact, from what we've seen, even beyond economics, what we've seen in the social sphere, we've seen with the police enforcing the lockdown, that what's happening is quite the contrary. And here, if I may, there's this book I was going through for some other review that I was doing, How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley. And this is not to discuss fascism here. He spoke about how in multiple countries, the plight kind of almost can do what you said to make people aware of it, but it can also reinforce fascist propaganda that the nation is under siege, that aliens are a threat, both within and outside borders. But it's got a lovely sentence with which Stanley ends his introduction, which is, the suffering of strangers can solidify the structure of fascism, but it can also trigger empathy once another lens is clicked into place. So I think this whole business of supplying this other lens, this other way of looking at things, which appears very commonsensical once we sit and discuss it. But obviously people who are in charge do not want to take responsibility for it, because that will have grievous consequences of being saddled with the burden of having to do their job and deliver results.
So, Seema ji, I've just asked you, what do you think should we do, and whether there is a realization in various circles of whether that should be done. I'm going to ask you a third question. Let's assume that we proceed on the same path that we have been walking on. You mentioned fascism. I'm not sure, and I mean I could be wrong, but I think in some lecture, Amartya Sen in fact says that poor health harms democracy. If there isn't enough medical facilities, so on and so forth, then ultimately you're harming democracy also, because he says democracy isn't just about मैं गया और मैंने वोट डाल दिया एक दिन, once in 5 years, etc. What I want to ask you is, and I would hope for a slightly broader answer. What happens if we don't change our path? If we think that nahi, this pandemic was it was a very bad, very rough speed bump. Now we are over it. We just need to pick the pieces together and go back to what we were doing. What happens if we do that?
So the long and short is that what really happens is that people suffer. So, that the lived lives of people will be rotten. And I'm sure this is something that I'm sure Mr. Arun Maira will reflect on it in much more detail about what happens with the economics of it. But I think what really it's not going to happen. There is no credible way in which the economy, as I said, the whole prosperity, the point that Abhijit Banerjee, the Nobel laureate and economist, says that the puzzle is not why India is not growing now, but how it grew at all. So it sort of grew because of this little, you can call it jugaad, or this little informality, or there was a little window that we allowed some crack to come in, and it stood on very uneven stilts. But now when it's all come crashing down, you've sent all your migrants back. Of course, a lot of them have come back to try and assemble that dodgy doll's house again. I don't think it's going to be business as usual. So it may not, we'll be able to paper over it in some way and, oh, sab chal raha hai, aise chal raha hai. But I don't think it's going to be like that. And you're finding that the downside of that in terms of violence, in terms of what young people are lost for what is to be done. There are no jobs. After all, how are those jobs going to be generated? So I think what we're missing is a blueprint for even business as usual. What we have right now is just stasis. I don't see any government spending going on, any alternative way of enabling young people, and we're losing the demographic dividend. The demographic dividend is a very timely kind of opportunity to have young people whom you can use to push up incomes or to push up the prosperity levels of the country. So I think nothing's really happening. It's not even business as usual, which can't happen because that was also a product of many complicated things happening. I don't think we're in a position to replicate that. We can't suddenly go back to those times. And even if that were to happen, you'll just have more misery. And at the end result will be that you'll have an unhealthy population, a more troubled people, and a lot of people who are kind of very rightly so, a lot of young people who are concerned about the nature of the world and if it really cares about